So why are we going to talk about IT pen testing in an OT pen testing course? Idea is we are going to use a common scenario that we see in the real world that OT cybersecurity consultants, just even OT engineering consultants and PLC technicians and engineers, they all know this trick of, a lot of plants have that old Windows system sitting in the corner, but nobody knows the password. The only person that knew the password was Bob, and Bob retired 20 years ago, and Bob's no longer with us. So how do we get access to that machine? So, well, everybody knows how we can use a tool like Metasploit to reset that administrator password to gain access to the machine. That's what we're going to walk through. But so as we're walking through the IT pen test process, just remember we're really thinking about it and looking at it from the OT perspective. But this is the one section where we'll talk about those IT tactics and techniques and breaking into Windows systems, where the rest of the course we're focused on, okay, now how do we break in or control and impact OT or ICS assets and the processes that they control out in the real world. So let's go ahead and look at IT pen testing in this section. So in this part, we're going to talk about IT pen testing, yes, but we're going to look at it from the OT perspective. And I want to talk about IT pen testing because there is a lot we can take from IT pen test, and that's very relevant to OT pen testing. Now, again, there's a lot of resources out there that talk about how to attack traditional IT systems like Windows machines or web services that are in the OT network. And that's great. And we touch on that a little bit, but there's a million courses and books out there that talk about those different types of attacks and IT penetration testing tactics and techniques. That's not what we're talking about here, but I do want to touch on it a little bit, right? Just to kind of set the playing field for the rest of the course. So again, we're going to look at IT pen testing, but from the OT perspective in this part of the course. Now, I was sharing different case studies at the beginning of each part, and this is actually one of my own, and this goes back probably 20 years when I was actually doing a IT pen test for a large entertainment company that does a lot of manufacturing. And I was working for them. They gave me a list of public IP ranges that they wanted to see if I could break into any of their networks around the world from the internet. And there was a range of IP addresses that stood out. Most of the ranges didn't have anything publicly exposed. There was just nothing there. But there was one range that really jumped out because it had 5 or 6 hosts. It had a lot of open ports. One of the systems that was exposed was actually a firewall. It had the firewall management interface exposed to the internet. Oops. And it actually had really easy to guess credentials to log in. They weren't default credentials, but they were really easy to guess. It was a really easy to guess password with the default administrator name. And so I was able to gain access to the firewall. And then based off of the information just that I was even seeing in the firewall, it became readily apparent that, oh yeah, this was not my client's network. This was a completely different company. It was actually one of the larger casinos in Vegas. There's still one of the largest casinos in Vegas. And so, of course, I totally freaked out because I'm very, as you might tell by class already, making sure that when we do pen testing, we have authorization so we're not breaking the law. So I did contact the casino, explain to them the issue. They were very understanding. They were thankful that I let them know about the issue. I could have, I guess, kept my mouth shut. They never probably would have known I was there. And then went back to my client and let them know, you have a mistake with your list of IP ranges, and the client contact said, oh yeah, that was my bad. I wrote down the wrong IP address for that one. I was like, okay, but sweating bullets. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. One, double check your client's work before you start testing. And some of the other lessons that we're going to talk about as we go along, things like, what about those exposed firewall management interfaces? What if you have an IT OT DMZ and you're exposing that firewall management interface to the IT network? I've seen this. I've seen this more than a few times, and I know a lot of other folks that have as well. And so again, there's a lot, and that's just one example of these different ways we can take our tactics and techniques, right? The ways we break into IT networks and systems and apply those to OT. So we still do want to talk about IT pen testing. Why is it important in an OT pen test course? Well, we do realize, right? Most attacks, the majority of attacks against OT networks come from IT. That's the facts. So I always say, at least people need to understand, if you're working in OT cybersecurity, no matter what your position is, at least it's a good idea to have a basic understanding of IT attacks, IT-based attacks, so you understand what's happening out there as it could then be coming for you, especially all those Windows machines we have on our OT networks that we talked about. Again, we just started to talk about that there's a lot of tactics, techniques, right? The ways we break into systems that we can take from IT when we start looking at, well, how do I, quote unquote, break into or attack or evaluate the security of different OT or ICS assets? There are a lot of Windows machines, and sure, some Linux machines, but a lot of Windows machines on OT networks. Again, this is just something that a lot of people don't realize. I didn't have a clue until I actually went to my first plant. And now when I go to a lot of different sites, it's Windows everywhere. And again, there's a little Linux sprinkled in there from time to time, but it's mostly Windows, at least that I see. And that's in sites of all sizes and across most sectors. One thing we also have to be wary of, though, is that a lot of OT assets these days, even down to sensors now, actually have web interfaces that you can connect to. Well, those web interfaces, right, those websites, they could have vulnerabilities in the way they're coded. Or the web server, right, that they're running on that serves up that page could have vulnerabilities. And then those vulnerabilities could give you access to the underlying system. So a lot of those web-based attacks we use in IT are also very relevant in the OT world if those web applications sit on the OT network. And then it goes back to, we touched on this in the last section, but when you look at the majority of industrial organizations, right, OT companies, the owners and the operators of these OT environments reach out because they want a OT pen test, but they're really just paying for an IT pen test. Things like an assumed breach scenario where we give them access to the IT network and then they try to pivot or move into the OT network from IT, like a real attacker or a piece of ransomware might. But they might not ever touch a real control system like a PLC or an HMI. They're just moving from Windows machine to Windows machine. They're just moving from the IT network to the OT network, right? And a lot of that's, we don't want them touching control systems like PLCs and HMIs that are in production because that's where we have safety and operational availability issues. But that's why we are talking about IT pen testing. Now, we're going to use an example that really is a trick that a lot of OT cybersecurity consultants and even engineers and PLC technicians know about, because it is a very common scenario that you can go into a plant and there's a computer sitting in the corner and nobody has touched it in probably 10 years. And it's an older Windows machine. And it used to be run and managed by Bob. And Bob retired 10 years ago. Or, Bob unfortunately is no longer with us. And so we can't get the password to log into this system if we actually needed to. And what if there was an urgent issue, or at least an issue where maybe we finally got to a point where we actually had to upgrade software on that system 10 years down the road? It happens, but we need the password. Well, why don't we just hack it? And so a lot of OT cybersecurity consultants and engineers and PLC techs, they know at least some of the basics of IT pen testing to be able to break into that one Windows machine to reset the local administrator account. And that's that scenario that we're going to walk through using the EternalBlue vulnerability in Windows that you might have heard about. So when we go back and we look at the IT pen testing methodology, or we talk about pre-engagement, everything that happens before we actually do the fun stuff, before we actually get to do the penetration testing, the reconnaissance, the network scanning, right? Finding more information about those assets, the enumeration, right? Finding the vulnerabilities. Then we want to exploit those vulnerabilities to gain access to different systems. And then what do? Right? We move from machine to machine, gain additional control of more machines so we can look for things like sensitive information. So the engagement, right? That's the fun part. Of course, what the client's really paying for, sure, not only the testing, but they really want the report. They want the findings. Because ultimately, they're paying for a pen test because they want your help in finding their security gaps. Help them find the problems within their cybersecurity program. And then help them understand how to address the issues. Help them understand the priority in which they need to address those, and maybe even make additional suggestions to improve their program over time. So in a nutshell, right, that's IT pen testing. Right? Between the pre-engagement, everything we do to work with the client before we do the fun stuff, and then we get to the reporting, which I've never met really anybody that likes to do reporting. I love the fact that the report can help the client, and so I want to write an excellent report, and hopefully that's what will help you do at the end of this course. But I mean, I don't have a lot of fun writing reports necessarily. Just warning you. So when we talk about the pre-engagement phase, and we're just going to go through these real quickly, just a few notes I think everybody should be aware of, because a lot of these will also apply when we talk about OT pen testing. So when we look at understanding the scope, well, what are we actually testing? This is where we work with the client and they'll give us a list of what we talked about. We can get a list of IP addresses, whether they're external or internal. We just need to make sure we double check the client's work. They might give us some domain names to start with. Maybe it's just their main domain name. Maybe they have additionals that they're going to provide us with. Or maybe they only give us their one main domain, like the one they use with the main company website and for their email addresses. But we can use that for Reconnaissance and OSINT to find other connected domains that are relevant to the organization. What websites they might have, especially those that are exposed to the internet. What other applications might they have, especially those that are exposed to the internet, because those websites, those applications, they could have vulnerabilities that we could use to gain access to this system that's then sitting on their network and have that as our initial foothold. We do have to make sure we understand, what systems are out of scope. And these should be spelled out. Right? Mission critical systems that the company is worried about. If they go down during testing, then there's a significant impact to the organization. I know, like, we have projects that we work with where they might have 10,000 construction workers on the job. So they'll tell you, right, don't touch the payroll servers, because if the payroll servers go down and people don't get paid on Friday, they're not going to show up to work on Monday. And if they don't show up to work on Monday, then that project, it falls behind schedule, not only a day, but potentially weeks or months, just from that small time for people not showing up. So we have to understand, what do we not touch? And then what type of testing are we going to do? So in IT pen testing, I love doing black box, but well, like even with the client we were mentioning the example earlier, right? We still ran into trouble even knowing a little bit of information that the client provided. Because the idea of a black box is that the client doesn't give us any information. They just said, hack us, which I love. Now, I prefer to do it at least on the internal side, right? It's like, let me come into an office, let me plug into the network, and don't tell me anything, just let me go to town, right? That's probably some of the most fun I could ever have. But black box is where the client doesn't tell us anything. White box is where they tell us everything. And that's more like we would see in the OT ICS world, because the more we know, the more that helps us increase the chance that we don't impact safety, that we don't impact production. And then, of course, gray box is somewhere in between, which is what most pen tests tend to be, just to varying degrees. Now, are you doing internal versus external pen testing? Right? Are you external is where the attacker or the pen tester is sitting out on the internet trying to break into the network? Or are you just internal where they come in, right? You give them access, or maybe over the VPN, but they have access to your internal network and see what they can do, or both. And then there's other types of pen testing, so things like social engineering. Are you going to require them to send phishing emails to your employees to see if they can trick somebody into clicking on a link or opening up an attachment? A lot of times organizations don't do things like social engineering because they realize that at least one employee is always going to click. So let's not waste the money. We're going to assume the employee will click. That's the idea behind an assumed breach scenario that we're going to come back and talk about. If I find a vulnerability, am I going to try to exploit that? In IT, usually that's not an issue. Sure, go ahead. In OT, no. Not in production, at least. Fuzzing, that's, if you're not familiar with the concept, that's where we use usually tools to send a bunch of garbage, essentially, at an application or a system just to see what happens. Sometimes you can get systems to crash. That's how you can find different types of attacks like buffer overflows. And while you might want to do that in IT, I wouldn't even do it in IT in production, but we definitely wouldn't want to do that in OT in production. But you could do it in a test environment, sure. Knock yourself out. And sometimes there's just testing where you're just watching what's going on in the environment. And honestly, there's a lot you could see and that you can pick up on just by walking through a facility. One of the things that we'll come back and talk about later in the course is how PLCs have what they call an operational mode. And so you'll see PLCs in different operational modes like run, stop, program, remote. Could be a whole list depending on the type of PLC it is. But one of the things that you should be looking for as you're going through is that these PLCs oftentimes have a physical key switch or like a little dip switch that can set the operational mode. And some operational modes are more secure than others. Like people will usually equate run with the most secure version. So when I go through facilities, are all those PLCs that I'm seeing, is the key switch in run mode or not? It's not a silver bullet, but it's one of those things that we can look for by doing a walkthrough. Now we work with the client to understand, right? What are they trying to test? In IT, right, we can usually have some common goals in IT pen testing. Like, we want you to check how Active Directory is configured and see if there's any vulnerabilities in the way we have it set up. Right? That's a very common type of pen test, or at least part of a pen test. They might have you try to test specific security controls, right? Come in, maybe you run Defender, Windows Defender as your EDR, your endpoint detection and response tool, or maybe CrowdStrike. And you want to see, can the pen tester bypass those security controls? Or maybe they implemented a new Wi-Fi detection system. Can you plant a Wi-Fi access point on the network and see if they detect it or not? I actually got to do a couple of those engagements. Those were some of the most fun I've ever had. And you start to get the idea, right? Different objectives from the client. What are they really trying to get to? And sometimes, I've brought in pen testers and just said, just go at it. Essentially, do as much damage as you can without crashing anything. But I want you to find, right? Think like an attacker, act like an attacker, find as many gaps as you can, as you have time for. And the rules of engagement determine things like, well, when is the testing going to happen? Is it during production hours? When someone's there and available to fix an issue if something happens because of the pen test? Or do you want to do it outside of production hours? Because if something breaks, you don't want it to impact employees. Who are the pen testers going to call if they find a significant or critical issue? Like, what if you do find a firewall with easy to guess or maybe default credentials that are exposed to the internet? Or I have been in pen tests where I have found attackers in the environment, or at least signs of attackers in the environment. That's something that, the client should know right away. Sometimes you might, and this is rare, but more common in OT than IT, is you might have a list of steps that you're going to perform, a series of tests. You might have to get authorization for each of those steps. In a lot of cases, especially with newer security controls like the endpoint detection and response that we were talking about earlier, a lot of times you'll look at disabling those, at least on one machine that the pen tester is using, so that way it doesn't hinder the rest of their testing. Because if you're just going to sit there with an EDR tool and stop them from doing their job, you're just wasting money. Like, no, let them use their attack tools. Let them actually do the pen test and find your security issues, and then go back and turn your EDR tool back on. And then we also talk about, are we going to try to be sneaky or not? That's one more red team when we talk about trying to be sneaky or quiet or hidden on the network. When I do pen testing, right, I'm not worried about being sneaky. I mean, I have 20, 30, 40, maybe 80 hours on a network. That's not a ton of time in some of the larger environments. I don't have time for super slow scans to avoid being detected by intrusion detection. And you know what? As much pen testing as I've done, it's actually pretty rare for security teams to actually detect the traffic, because if they are doing network security monitoring, a lot of them just aren't doing a very good job. And I hate telling companies that and actually showing them proof, but at the end of the day, it's part of what they're paying for and what they need to know, where they're falling down, right? Where they have those issues. And of course, ultimately, we need to get authorization from the client that says you are legally allowed to run these pen test activities in our environment. And it should be authorized by the highest authority in the organization. Now, depending on the size, like our company, our CEO is not authorizing pen tests. Our CISO isn't, but I do as a direct representative of the CISO, who's a direct representative of the CEO. In smaller organizations, it would be the owner, or maybe one of their direct reports. I think you get the idea. You just don't want I said nothing against a junior cybersecurity analyst, but you probably can start to think, right? They don't have the authority to provide authorization to do pen testing. Not at their level. Maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road as they rise through the ranks. But that's all the pre-engagement, everything that we're going to do before the fun actually begins. So when we talk about the engagement phase, this is where we're actually doing the pen test. This is where we're breaking into the network. This is where we're breaking into systems by exploiting different vulnerabilities that we find. And we break it up into these 4 phases. Different people use different frameworks. This is just the one that I've always used. Some people like the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which I think can be effective, but it has a more, I always talk about military or government feel to it. So I don't know. I just like to keep things practical and simple. And that's why I always use this approach. So we're really talking about starting with reconnaissance. And reconnaissance often is all about finding information about the target environment that will help us be more successful in our pen test and breaking in. And that's why I say relevant information, because you can use Google and a lot of other tools out on the internet to perform reconnaissance, including OSINT, right? Using open source intelligence, using freely available information on the internet, even on the dark web. Some you could pay for, some you don't, right? Using tools like Google or some sites like DNSlytics, DNSdumpster, a lot of these that we're going to look at. They're free. Some resources like DNSdumpster, if you want full access, right, you have to pay. But so they'll give you some results for free. You want full access, you have to pay something. But the idea is that you want to find as much relevant information about the target environment, because that will increase the chance of you being successful. And that really stuck with me. I actually learned that. I got to work with the U.S. Navy SEALs for about 2 years. I'm actually from San Diego. They have a huge base in San Diego, and it just kind of came about when I was doing some other work with the Navy and the Marine Corps in San Diego. And working with mostly their support teams, right? I'm not out there doing 500 pull-ups on the base, but working with mostly the support teams, right? You and they weren't telling me anything like top secret, but right, through some of the stories that they did share, it was this idea, right, that you gather as much information about a target environment before a SEAL team would go in, right? The more relevant information you have about that area that they're going to be operating in, right? It increases the chance of not only their mission being a success where they hit their mission goals or objectives, but that everybody comes home safely. And it's the same in pen testing, right? The more relevant information we have, the more successful we're going to be. And we'll see some examples where we can find a ton of information. We can find gigs and gigs of information about a target environment. But I probably need less than 1% of that actual data to be successful. So the hardest part of reconnaissance is not finding the information, it's weeding out all the garbage. Right? It's being distracted by everything you don't need and understanding what's going to help you in being successful. So now reconnaissance is made up of passive reconnaissance and active reconnaissance. In the IT world and with authorization, you can do both. Now think passive reconnaissance is where we're using free, usually free information that's out on the internet or the dark web to find out information that we can use to target the organization that we're pen testing. In passive reconnaissance, we're never sending a network packet towards the target environment. So we're not breaking any laws. Active reconnaissance, that's where we use a tool like Nmap to scan the public IP ranges of that target environment. We are generating network packets, right? We are sending them on the wire. They are hitting systems at the client's network. So that's active reconnaissance. The key is active reconnaissance, you have to have authorization to do. Passive reconnaissance, you don't. You can do passive reconnaissance anytime, right? It's not illegal to use Google or tools like Shodan or DNSdumpster. I used to, when I was doing pen testing full time, if we would get a potential new client that we talked to, there was one that was a production company for the Walking Dead TV series when it was huge back in the day. And it's like, well, we didn't have the job yet, but I don't know, it'd be kind of fun just to do the OSINT for them because it would be a really interesting project. And I would do that a lot. So, and sometimes you would win those jobs, sometimes you wouldn't. So if you won the job, great. You have a lot of the work already done. And if not, that's okay. It was still fun. It was still worth it. But that's the difference between our passive reconnaissance, where we're not sending any packets towards the target network. We can gather all that information without any authorization, and we're not breaking any laws. One of the great tools that I love to use when doing passive reconnaissance is DNSdumpster. So this is DNSdumpster, and I don't know when it first came out, but it had been out a couple of years before I knew about it, and when I found it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. It's a little limited more these days. In fact, they just even restricted further the amount of free records you get, unfortunately. But it's a great place to start. And what you can do is you go and you enter a domain name like I use Netflix all the time because they do have an active bug bounty program, right? So they pay people to find vulnerabilities on their network. And so we put in a domain name like netflix.com, click start, it's done. And it'll tell you, hey, if you only get 50 results for free. You can actually even see down below it says we have 185 records. You're only getting 50 for free. It's like, okay, I'll work with that. But what you're seeing is, especially down here in the individual host records, is that we can find all the essentially fully qualified domain names that DNSdumpster is aware of that's associated with netflix.com. So these could be a lot of either different websites or systems that are exposed to the internet. Sometimes you can even see internal records because they'll have a private IP address. Netflix actually had some of those exposed not too long ago, only a couple months ago. But here you can see, oh, okay, there's about netflix.com. There's advertising.netflix.com, b2b.netflix.com, b2bt.netflix.com. Right? You get the idea. Right? And sometimes those names, the naming convention could actually give away sensitive pieces of information, or at least it gives us an idea of what that system might be used for, and it might help an attacker or a pen tester know where to start. Like if I see b2b.netflix.com and b2bt.netflix.com, I might assume the T is for test, and test environments are usually less secure than production. So if I had to choose between those two targets, I would start with B2BT. Now we also see the IP address of the system. We see the ASN, or the autonomous system number. The ASN is usually used for larger companies, usually where they have a ton of different subnets on the internet that are just scattered about, and so they pull them together for administrative purposes, especially on the telecom side. I've seen smaller and medium-sized organizations with them, but usually it's a larger organization like my day job. Right? We have dozens of subnets. We have a large class B on the internet, and they're all grouped into an ASN that's associated with our company name. Well, why that matters, and that's what we're going to look at next, is if I'm scrolling down through this list, and my goal is to break on or break into the Netflix corporate network. If I look at about.netflix.com and the IP address and the ASN number, and it shows me based off of that information, well, that probably website or that system is hosted in the Amazon cloud. Well, the Amazon cloud is not the Netflix corporate network, so I'm not going to attack this target. Same thing with advertising.netflix.com, right? It's in the Amazon cloud. Not my goal. My goal is not to break into Amazon. It's to break into the Netflix network. But if I look at those next ones, B2B, B2BT.netflix.com, cast-oc.netflix.com, they're in an IP range, which is in an ASN associated with Netflix. Now, this could still be in a data center, but a data center that's like controlled by Netflix and has a connection back to the corporate network, or it could be hosted on the corporate network itself. It's at least a lot closer than something hosted in the Amazon cloud, right, in AWS. So that's what, from an attacker perspective, what I'm looking at those ASNs for is to understand, okay, of this domain and all these potential targets, what's hosted in the cloud and what looks like it's actually hosted on the corporate network, or at least a network segment that will have a connection to the corporate network. So that's DNSdumpster. You can also see it does banner grabbing, which means if it finds an open port, it'll see, well, what's actually running on that open port. So there's not always a lot of results, and you'll get more out of tools like Shodan or Census that we're going to look at later. But here you can see, right, that, AWS uses CloudFront, right? Or here down below, we see we're using free Nginx as the web server. Oh, well, it's great, right? What if I know the version of that version, or that version of Nginx running on that server? Then I could look for vulnerabilities, and I could use those vulnerabilities to potentially gain administrative access or some type of access on that web server. And that could be my initial foothold on the network. So that's DNSdumpster, right? It's a really cool tool. A little less cool now that they only give you 50 records for free, but still a very cool tool to really quickly, right, start to get not only a list of fully qualified domain names associated with a specific domain, but you get, sure, the IP addresses, but what I really want to see is those ASNs and how they're mapped out. So that way I can determine what looks like it's hosted in the cloud versus what could be on-prem. So if you're following along at home and using the lab book, that lab 3.1 introduces you to passive reconnaissance and walks you through some of the steps we were just talking about, like using DNSdumpster. So again, this focuses on passive reconnaissance, everything we can do without authorization. And we don't need authorization to use tools that are freely accessible out on the internet, like Google or DNSdumpster or Shodan. So that's lab 3.1. So we've talked about passive reconnaissance we can do without authorization. Well, now let's talk about active reconnaissance. It's where we are generating network packets. We are sending them to a target organization. So we do have to have authorization. And there's questions, can this be detected by the defenders? If I'm a pen tester, I'm not normally going to be worried about being sneaky, right? That's more, again, red team activities where you have a lot longer, right, to do your testing over time. But as we mentioned earlier, right, the more information we have about a target environment, which includes the possibility of having vulnerabilities, that we can use that information to be more successful in our pen test, right? In breaking in. That's what the customer is paying for us to really test. Could an attacker get into the environment? And what could they do? So when we talk about active scanning, that's where we're really talking about using some type of port scanner like Nmap. Nmap's the most popular port scanner. It's been around for 25 years. Probably not going anywhere, right? It hasn't been replaced yet. And there's definitely alternatives out there. But it gets the job done, even at 25 years old. In this example, you can see we're doing what we call a ping sweep. So you can see Nmap and then an IP range of 10.129.23.0/24. And then dash lowercase s capital P. So that's one way to do a ping sweep. Though what it's doing behind the scenes, if you actually use a packet sniffer to watch how the tool is operating, and this is more important in OT, right? Because we want to make sure, are we sending packets on an OT network that we shouldn't? Because if I do dash s capital P, because we say, oh, it's a ping sweep. Well, what it does, sure, it could send an ICMP packet to every IP address or potential IP address on a particular target subnet. But it also does additional checks. Like it'll check to see, is anything listening on TCP port 80? Because that's the default port for web servers. So maybe there's an asset in the environment that's blocking ping, that's blocking ICMP, but it actually is running a web server. And so you could find those additional hosts. And in IT, I'm probably not worried about that. But in OT, it's a very different story. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for now. But we're going to look at using Nmap for some like general usages of port scanners in IT and OT if you have that authorization and the engineering and operations team have guaranteed, which is hard to do, right, that you're not going to impact safety or production. And I've heard horror stories of tools like Nmap, and this is even in new environments in 2025, bringing down systems. Or even what's sometimes more common is that systems don't go down, but because the networking equipment was just kind of thrown together and there's no true management of the network, the network will actually crash. And then everything goes down, all from a simple Nmap scan. But let's look at Nmap. Now, to look at Nmap, like we did in this example, we need an environment. And the easiest way to get people an environment to play with, especially in our Windows EternalBlue example that we're using here, is to look at the Hack the Box environment. And if you're not familiar with Hack the Box is an environment that pen testers and people that want to become pen testers use to practice their skills and learn. And so we'll go ahead and log in. And once we're logged in, you can see they actually have a lot of kind of courses. They help guide your learning path down, which is really exciting. I'm just going to jump into practice with hands-on labs. Because the hands-on labs, what this is really going to be is a bunch of virtual machines, for the most part, that they have put together, usually on an individual case-by-case basis. So if we click over on the left-hand side and go to machines, I'm going to go to retired machines, because the one that we're going to look at that has the EternalBlue vulnerability, it's one of their original machines. And you can see it's already listed here for us. So I'm going to click on this, and then it's off right now. So I'm going to click spawn machine. So it's going to turn on the Windows machine that has this EternalBlue vulnerability in it that we're going to exploit. And once it's on, we'll see the IP address. So looking at the Hack the Box machine, we can see our target system blue is up and running. We can see it's at a target IP address of 10.129.111.68. So I can go ahead and click on this. It'll copy the IP address into memory, into the cache, and I'm going to jump over into my Kali Linux machine. And so in Kali Linux, I already have a VPN connection set up between my Kali Linux machine and the Hack the Box network where the blue system is located. So to test to make sure that the blue system is up and running, I'm just going to go ahead and ping it. If I can spell. Oh my Lord. Hit enter. And we can see we can ping it. Not the greatest response times, but that's not horrible for going over a VPN to hack the box. So now we're going to go back, and one thing we were going to do was emulate that ping sweep that I put in quotes. We're going to do a Nmap ping sweep on the subnet, assuming that's what they call a class C subnet, with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. So we're going to do 10.129.111.0/24, and then just do dash lowercase s capital P. And that's going to launch that ping sweep. Now again, if we're watching this with Wireshark, we could see all of the activity that's going on behind the scenes. And it's definitely always suggest people do to learn better how the tools work. I think sometimes it's a little confusing doing it in class though, but there are some labs that will walk you through that process later on. So definitely don't skip those labs if you're not a fan of network packet captures or using Wireshark. Definitely is important to understanding networking fundamentals and when we get into OT pen testing. And unfortunately, we can see in this example, unlike the example we had in the slides, the only machine on the network is the one that we're targeting. Usually with Hack the Box, there's a few other machines online, so I'm a little bit disappointed with this. But at least our machine is up and running, and we know we can ping it, so it's available. But again, here's the screenshot we were looking at where you can see that it actually finds a whole bunch of hosts. In fact, the list actually scrolls off the screen. So you can see .4, .7, .48, .64, .96, right? Lots of targets, at least potential targets. A lot more than we have in our setup with just one host. But one's all we need. So when we have IP addresses, what are we really looking for, right? We know there's a live host there. Well, what are we really talking about though? So once we have that IP address, really what I want to do next is I'm going to scan that IP address or that system for open ports. So we have TCP ports, there's 65,535, and there's 65,535 UDP ports. If we have the time, we're going to scan all those TCP ports. Now, UDP is a little tricky on how it works, so we're going to test a couple of ports there, usually, when doing a pen test, and that's in IT and OT. But we're going to look for open ports because those open ports allow us to make a connection, right? That socket that we can use to connect to a remote system and talk with an application or a service. Because then as I find out more information about what is that application? Oh, it's a web service. Well, who makes the web service? Apache? Nginx? Is it Microsoft IIS? And not just the version or the vendor, but yeah, what version of the software? Because if we know the version of that particular piece of software, then we can look up to see, does it have any vulnerabilities that we could use to attack it? So it's going from IP addresses to open ports to finding what services and applications are running on those ports to then finding the vulnerabilities in those services and the applications that could give us access to the machine. Now, if we want to do an individual port scan on just a host, we can still just use Nmap and give it the IP address of the target system. If we're back in Kali Linux, if I want to do just a port scan, a default Nmap scan on that one target blue host, we're just going to say Nmap and then the IP address and let it run. And what it's going to do, it's not going to test all 65,535 TCP ports. It's going to just test the most commonly used 1,000 ports that are on the internet. And you can see it comes back with 9 different ports that it found open. Now we see 135, 139, 445. If you're not familiar, if I see those, it's like, boom, it's a Windows machine. Those are services that are associated with Windows. And sometimes you can see alternatives running on Linux, but usually that combination, 135, 139, 445, it's a Windows machine. Those other high order ports that you see in 49,000 don't really mean much at this point. Now, in some respects, yeah, I know there's open ports, but remember, we want to find out more information about the services and the applications behind those ports. And Nmap gives us some options to do that. One of those is we can do what we call a service scan. So if you run a service scan with the dash lowercase s capital V, as in Victor, you'll see it'll actually take a little longer, because what it's doing is when it finds an open port, it's actually sending additional pieces of information, almost like additional checks, trying to get some responses from that service or that application. So it helps Nmap understand what's actually running on that port. And here you can see where we get the response back. And so, yeah, it looks like earlier where we see the open ports, but now it gives us more information, because it says TCP 135 is used for Windows RPC, and 139 is used for Windows NetBIOS, and 445 is used for, this is where you can actually see a couple important pieces of information, because it's saying, oh, hey, we have Windows 7 to 10. So we know it's not something older like Windows XP, and it's not something newer like Windows 11, but it's somewhere between Windows 7 and Windows 10. So it's narrowed down the field a little bit. We also see it's in a work group called Work Group. And if you're not familiar with what this means, what we're actually seeing is it says that that Windows machine is not in a Windows domain. It's not joined to Active Directory. It's just in the default work group called Work Group, right? So it's not secured with things like group policies, and doesn't have centralized management of things like usernames and passwords. So it's probably going to be less secure. And then again, we don't get a lot of other information on those other ports. And again, it's not necessary for this conversation. Now we see another piece of information that might be useful. So we see the name of the Windows machine is Harris-PC. Like, okay, that might come in useful down the road. So we found some open ports. We found some additional information about what's running on those ports. Now the next thing we normally would check is, well, for versioning. Now, because the Windows ports like 135, 139, and 445 are very particular because of the different operating systems or the way Windows works, what we're actually going to do is we're going to use a vulnerability script that Nmap has. And Nmap's not supposed to necessarily be or used as a vulnerability scanner, but it does have a few scripts that we can run to see if there's any vulnerabilities associated with SMB server message block, which is really what we're seeing running on these Windows ports, or TCP 445. So I'm going to go ahead and use Nmap, right, with that IP address for our target. And then I'm going to specify it's -- script. So we're going to say we're going to run a script, or in this case, we're going to run every script that starts with SMB -vuln. So there's actually, I think, 6, 7, 8 different individual scripts. So they're checking for 6, 7, 8 different things. But saying run Nmap, and for all these open ports, check to see if they have any of these known SMB vulnerabilities. And so we get the results back. And this is a little weird because the different scripts are written by different people, but you can see it tested for this one Microsoft patch from 2010 to see if it was missing. And it says what it was looking for was basically not found, which means it's not vulnerable. Same thing when it was testing for MS10 054. It says false. So it didn't find the vulnerability it was looking for. But when we test for the EternalBlue vulnerability, like we were expecting, it's from 2017, which in the OT world, right? That was just yesterday. It's not necessarily a long time ago. And so you can see that MS17-010, yeah, it looks like it's vulnerable. So remember, we took an IP address, we mapped out the open ports, we mapped it to services and applications, and then the versioning to determine if there was a vulnerability or not. And in this case, it looks like there's a vulnerability. So once we identify a vulnerability, one of the best tools we can ever use is Metasploit. And again, this is a trick that a lot of OT cybersecurity consultants use. Some engineers know about it now. I teach engineers in my day job about Metasploit, different PLC tags. But we can use Metasploit, especially through Kali Linux, by just typing in MSF console. I always go to type in Metasploit. I've been doing that for, 20 years probably at this point, as long as Metasploit's been around. So we're going to run Metasploit through MSF console. H.C. Moore created Metasploit, and when he created it, it was like a whole new world opened up for a lot of people, because prior to Metasploit, you had to do a lot of coding, which I know I'm not doing, right? And it comes up with these neat little kind of randomized little cute little screens, little ASCII art. Like each time you run it, it comes up with something different. So here we have the little ninja, and it's still loading. But what is loading? And it has a bunch of different tools, and you can see them listed here. But the main thing that Metasploit automates for us is it gives us exploits. And you can see there's over 2,500 exploits, that's the code that we're going to use to take advantage of a vulnerability. And then we can actually see payloads. So the payload is what we send to the machine once we've exploited it. So once we've taken advantage of a vulnerability, and now we have the ability to have full control or some type of access to the system, we send it the payload, the code to tell it then what to do. Like reset the local administrator account password, or maybe create a connection from that machine to my machine, right? And that's very, very common. And so what we're going to do, because we know this machine is vulnerable to EternalBlue, I'm going to go ahead and search for MS17-010. That's the missing patch associated with the EternalBlue vulnerability. And that's a very popular vulnerability. It was actually an exploit originally stolen by the Russians from the American National Security Agency, or NSA. Oops. And it's been used to do a lot of damage over time. But in our case, right, we're going to use it to reset the password for that Windows machine sitting in the corner of the plant that nobody knows the password for. We're going to use the original exploit for it. There's actually a couple, but we're going to use the original one. And you can see it's actually on line 0. So I don't have to type anything other than I can just say use 0. So it's going to load the exploit. Remember, the exploit's the code that's going to take advantage of the vulnerability and give us some type of access on the machine. And then we have to send it a payload next to tell it what we want it to do. In this case, it's going to automatically load a default payload for us. This is a little weird at first if you've never seen something like this. But what this says is the target machine has to be Windows. Like, okay, well, we know it's definitely Windows. It has to be 64-bit, which probably is. It's going to open up a reverse TCP connection to our machine. So once this target machine is exploited, it's going to open up a connection to our machine, like a little, almost like a little VPN tunnel. And so we'll be able to run commands on that remote system as if we're sitting at it. And then it also loads into the memory of that machine this little, almost like this little operating system itself. It's like a little mini operating system kind of for hacking that you put in the memory of that machine, and it lets you to do certain things like dump passwords, and we're going to see how that works. So that's called Meterpreter. So we're going to say run this exploit, and when it runs successfully, push this payload into memory and open up a connection from the exploited system to our machine. Now there's a couple other pieces of information we have to check to make sure everything's configured correctly. So we're going to do show options. And what this is going to show us is whether we have to supply different pieces of information. Like in this case, we could see, yes, you need a piece of information. We haven't provided anything yet. And this is for our host or remote host. It's asking for, well, what's the IP address of the target? Like, oh yeah, duh, that makes sense. We have to tell it what to attack, right? So we're going to go ahead and set the R hosts to, and then the IP address of our target, which actually I probably still have in the cache. So I can probably just paste that and add that in. So if I do show options now and scroll up, you can see, oh yeah, our host is now fixed. And all of the other options I have that require data all have options or information provided. Like, great. And most of this is done automatically for us. Now, doing this over the VPN, this is a little tricky. So remember, what we wanted this payload to do is open up a reverse TCP connection from that machine to our machine. It's connected over the VPN with Hack the Box. This IP address that we're telling it to connect with is not the IP address on the VPN. It's not an IP address that machine can connect with. So even if we're able to exploit it and we say, hey, connect to this 192.168 address, it'll try to connect to it, but it won't have a route to get there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open up another terminal, and I'm going to run ifconfig to see what the IP address information is, what the IP address for our VPN tunnel is. And you can actually see it right here because there's ton0, so the VPN tunnel interface. And then the IP address that Hack the Box sees on the tunnel is 10.10.14.168. So I'm going to copy this. We're going to go ahead and exit out. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to change that L host to the IP address that is on the Hack the Box tunnel that machine can actually then interact with. So now if I show options, I can see, okay, there's my target IP address, and here is my IP address on my Kali Linux machine that the target machine can actually talk with. And then at that point, we just type in exploit. And so you'll start to see, it actually scans to see, is it vulnerable? And we even say, yeah, it looks like it's vulnerable. It's even 64-bit. It says it's Windows 7 Service Pack 1. So that's even more information than we had earlier. You see it's launching the exploit. It doesn't take very long before it's exploited. It's pushed now the payload over to the target machine. And we can see it has an open connection from that machine or from our machine to it. So now when I do something like sysinfo in Meterpreter, you can see, oh, it gives us all this different pieces of information, like the name. Oh, we saw that through Nmap earlier, but okay. So we know, yeah, that we're actually on that machine we targeted. And then, oh, yeah, Windows 7, right? Service Pack 1, 64-bit. It's using the UK version of English, the GBs for Great Britain. Right? We see it's in a workgroup, so it's not in a Active Directory domain unless somebody got really crazy and named that workgroup, which they could have. I'm not a big fan of necessarily Meterpreter because of the commands, right? And it's more you have to learn. Of course, you can hit question mark to tell you all of the different commands that you have. So it has a lot of really cool features for sure. Personally, I do like, and you can see second from the bottom, hash dump. So that pulls, you can see the local accounts that are on the machine, their ID, and then you can see the encrypted version of their password, the password hash. So then you can take that offline and crack it to figure out what the password is, or you can just use that to log into other machines remotely on the network if they're connected, like in an Active Directory domain, which this one's not, or if it's another machine using the same username and password. But in this case, we can see there's an account named administrator, the default administrator account, and we know that's true because the ID is 500. The guest account is always 501, and then the first user account we create on the machine is at 1000. And oh yeah, it's somebody named Harris, which makes sense because the host name is Harris PC. Now, what I really like to do is I just type in shell. And now you can see, oh yeah, it's like I'm sitting at the command line for that machine. And then I can run commands like the host name, right? Oh yeah, it really is Harris PC. Who am I? Right? Oh, I'm logged in with system. System's not even an account. In a way, it's kind of like I think of it as a virtual account, but it represents essentially the Windows kernel, which means it has the most privilege on the machine, even higher privileges than the administrator account. So I can do whatever I want with this machine. Well, what if I want to, in this case, remember the whole point of us breaking into this Windows machine was nobody knows what the password is to log into it. So I want to reset the administrator account password. So if I want to do that, and this is why I like using this, from just going to the command line, is when I go and type net user, and then the name of the account that I want to change, and then I can change it to whatever password I want. And so now, yeah, the password for the administrator account is now Star Wars 123 with @ for A's. And we're done. We've accomplished our mission. We're the OT cybersecurity consultant or engineer or PLC tech that saved the day. And then we can go and we can log into that Windows machine that everybody forgot their password because now, right, the password is Star Wars 123. It's a very real case scenario that happens a lot, believe it or not, in OT. So that's one way we can apply IT pen testing, right? Tactics and techniques, all of our different little tricks into the OT world. So looking back at the slides, this is everything we just walked through. So using the service scan, right? Using Nmap to test for the SMB vulnerabilities by using those different Nmap scripts. And so that's everything that Lab 3.2 will walk you through. Of course, it does require a hack the box account And I think they have free accounts to be able to do some of those older boxes. So you might not even have to pay for like a monthly account. They're not horribly expensive, but you wouldn't have to pay for that hopefully to do the exercise. And then going through using a tool like Metasploit, right, to be able to find that exploit, right, set it up, configure it correctly, that we then launch it, right, to then gain access to that remote host to where we can run commands. Not only, sure, tell me what the host name is and tell me what version of language you're running, right? But also, yeah, hey, let me drop to the shell and go ahead and change the password for the local administrator account. That was the whole objective, right, that we were aiming for. Or here you can see, right, we change it net user administrator to PLC for life 2025. I like that one better. But so you can see how you can use a tool like Metasploit pretty easily, right, to break into a Windows system and reset that local password. Breaking into Windows systems isn't that hard even today. And while sure, this is an example on a machine that's 10 years old ish, at the same time, a lot of those basics still apply in IT and remember in OT where we have so many Windows machines. And that's a big part of why I still wanted to do this walkthrough for this course. So Lab 3.3 will actually walk you through the rest of that exercise. So using Metasploit, targeting the blue system, gaining access, and then there's a few other things like, how can I poke around the machine? Maybe I can look for, what's the unencrypted password for that local administrator account? So you can use tools like Mimikatz. And that's a big part of post-exploitation, right? This idea of once we gain access to the machine, what do we do with it? And that was always a big question for me. I always wanted, like, I was actually pretty good at, breaking into machines from the internet with authorization, of course, right? Or give me internal access and I, gain access to a machine or Active Directory. But then there was always this question like, well, what do I do next? Like, what's important? And this is why we ask our clients, what's your goal with doing a pen test? And so that's what post-exploitation is all about. That's how MITRE ATT&CK actually came to be, because it was built by MITRE to answer the question of what do attackers do once they get that initial foothold on the network. Sure, it talks about how they get on the network as well, but that's not what it was designed to track. It was all about answering the question, what do attackers do once they're on the network, right? How do they escalate privileges, right? If I'm just get on access to one person's computer and I have normal user permissions, well, how do I escalate to an administrator account on that machine? How would I become a domain administrator so I could have access to all the Windows machines? How do I move from machine to machine? Or now, when we talk about moving laterally, well, how do I move from the IT network to the OT network? Is there a DMZ that I have to go between, that IT, OT, DMZ? Or maybe there's just a firewall. Or maybe there is no firewall. You'd be amazed at how many OT environments still today don't have a firewall between IT and OT. And some very large environments out there as well. None of my day customers. And then maintaining persistence, that's more for attackers, because, well, what if they're on a machine, that machine gets rebooted and that was how they had access to that system in the network? Well, how do they get access back? Or what if they're found out by the defenders and their access is removed? Do they have a backup way to get into the network and onto a machine? So there's a lot in post-exploitation. And we're not going to spend really any time here in IT, but remember, we also are going to talk about this from the OT perspective, and this is what we're going to talk about as we go throughout the rest of the course. So doing the reconnaissance, doing the discovery, the collection, as we call it in OT, or finding the assets on the network, finding information about those, finding vulnerabilities, escalating privileges once we've gained access, right, after exploiting vulnerabilities. And then what do we do? Ultimately, in the OT world, right, it's how do I have an impact on those physical processes that we have in the environment, right, that we control out in the real world? How do I create a blackout if I gained access to a power plant environment? How do I take that water treatment facility offline? How do I take the manufacturing plant offline? Could I create an explosion in a petrochemical facility? Again, I don't say these things to scare people. It's just a reality. These things could happen, and it doesn't actually have to be too hard for the attackers to do. And unfortunately, it's getting easier and easier as time goes on, especially because of AI. So Lab 3.4, though, will walk you through some of those post-exploitation activities, gaining passwords, like loading Mimikatz into memory through Meterpreter, right? Looking for sensitive files. So that's what those Lab 3.4 will bring you through, and kind of wrap up working with that blue system at Hack the Box. So hopefully you really enjoyed that. If it's something that you haven't seen before, or it's a good refresher. But again, it's a very common scenario to see in OT with that old Windows machine sitting in the corner that nobody knows the password for. So after all of the fun part of a pen test engagement, right, where we're actually getting paid, usually, to break into systems, to be break into networks. Or in this example, we talked about an OT consultant coming in, having to reset the local administrator password for that Windows machine that everybody's forgotten about. There's this idea that, of course, after the engagement, we actually have to come back to ultimately what the client's paying for. And the client's paying for the results. And so we're going to not only draft or write a report that's going to have our findings from the testing, but almost always, not always, but almost always, we're going to present those findings. And usually that presentation could include folks from executive leadership. So when you talk about writing a successful report, and here's just a couple of real quick highlights, because we're actually going to talk in detail about creating a successful OT pen test report in the last section of the course. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But again, we have to remember, this is what the client's paying for. This is where we demonstrate value, our value that we bring to the table in helping them find vulnerabilities, right? Finding gaps in their security program. That's in IT and OT. But we need to be able to tell the story of how the engagement unfolded, how we went about doing the testing. Now, it starts with an executive summary. That's usually 1-2 pages written at a high level. I always talk about write it to maybe a third grade level. And then it's not because executives aren't smart people. I mean, these are the people that are responsible for steering, very large organizations. But at the same time, they're very busy and they have other things to worry about, right? They have lots on their plate. So we want to keep it very simple, straightforward, and practical. Now, most of the report is actually going to have all the technical details, again, where we tell the story of how the testing unfolded, what we found, how we found it. And that's going to be in the technical details. That's written for the OT or the IT cybersecurity analyst, right? The CISO, the folks in IT and OT, the plant managers, the engineers, right? That the people that they can appreciate and use the technical details to help the environment become more secure. Now, each of the findings, so typically we'll have a list. Let's say we've performed a pen test and we have 10 different findings. And we're going to rate those based off of the associated risk. And usually that's the associated risk that we feel should be assigned to those items. Because I still get pen test reports today from some of the largest pen test organizations in the world And sometimes we could have conversations of, that this is either too high or maybe it's not high enough. So it still can be very subjective at times. That's even more true in OT than IT. But the idea is that we have those items, we assign them a risk level, so that way it helps the organization better understand, well, how quickly do I need to take care of this? Critical risk? Yeah, I mean, that's in the OT world, that presents a threat to safety and or operational availability. High risk? Yeah, there's still definitely some risk there. So probably sooner than later. Low and medium risk vulnerabilities, sometimes those are the ones that never get addressed because the environment doesn't see enough risk there to justify any associated cost with addressing it. But we'll talk more about that in the last part of the course. Usually in the executive summary, you'll have a chart like this that shows the number of critical, high, medium, and low findings. So it's just a quick snapshot of here's what we found, and I can immediately look at this and say, there's one critical. I know that's going to be really bad, and we need to make sure we get that taken care of. There's a couple of highs that we can address, and it looks like there's a bunch of mediums and some lows, so we also need to look at those and see if there's something we need to address. But it's that just quick visual to take a peek at and know exactly what's going on. Now, one thing that a lot of pen tests don't include, and this is in IT and OT, is once somebody comes in and does a pen test and finds issues, unfortunately, a lot of times those reports just end up on a shelf and get covered with dust, and the client never actually takes action on fixing the issues. So there can be times where they will take no action, which drives me crazy. I was just thinking of a story that I can't share. But suffice it to say, if you have a report, and I've seen this, and that's kind of what I was remembering, where done a pen test for a client, showed them some significant issues. They don't do anything about it. Well, what potentially could happen, right? Down the road, an attacker could find those same issues and use those vulnerabilities or those risks against them. And that's what I've seen happen in clients previously. And I've heard stories of this happening to friends as well. Maybe there's one, right? They just had a pen test. They were actually working on the issue, but it was a large project that was 6 to 9 months in their environment. And they still got attacked, and the attackers used that exact vulnerability or gap in their environment to gain access to their network. So when we get the report and we have a list of findings, we need to address them. A lot of environments, they don't address them, or what happens, they think they've addressed them, but they don't have the ability to test to make sure that they really did. A really good pen test report, and this comes from Ed Scotus at SANS, a really good pen test report will tell the client, hey, here's how to fix the issue, and here's how to verify that you fixed the issue. But ultimately, they really need to have the pen testers come back and verify that those issues were really fixed. Right? And it's not another 40, 80-hour engagement. It's maybe an hour or 2 or 3, depending on the number of findings, but to come back and just test for those findings. So consider having the pen testers come back to validate that the remediation actually occurred. And that's one way executive leaders and management team members can, at least maybe they don't have the technical knowledge. And sure, they want to trust their team members that they're going to fix those issues, but we trust them, but verify. So we'll bring the pen testers back and verify that everything got done. And then finally, we're going to have that report, and almost always we're going to present those findings. And this is partly to allow the clients to ask questions of the people that were actually doing the test. And I've been in some crazy tests before where I was working on a team one time, and the SVP basically over IT and cybersecurity basically slammed the phone down on the pen tester presenting the reports. And he's actually pretty kind of, I guess, infamous in the IT pen testing community, which made it even that much more interesting. And I actually kind of agreed with my boss, believe it or not. So final finding meetings can actually turn out to be pretty interesting. Usually, most of it is presenting the information. Again, remember, keep it at third grade level. Don't use technical terms, right? Don't use any acronyms. Keep it very straightforward. Keep it very simple. You really are communicating the risk that they need to be aware of and how to address it, and help them understand that plan or that strategy. And here's what you need to address, and here's how quickly you need to address it, right? Here's how to improve your cybersecurity over time. That's really what you need to communicate. And then they'll have the opportunity, of course, also to ask questions. Some of the big questions that you typically will hear are things like, well, are we good for security or not, right? Thumbs up or thumbs down. That's very common. Or even probably more common, especially over the last couple of years, is, well, how do we compare to our competitors or other people, other companies like us? So there's this idea that executives can use that answer to gauge, right? Hey, if we're doing as well as our competitors or others like us, then we're probably spending, quote unquote, enough on cybersecurity. If we're behind the others, then we need to increase spending. If we're ahead, that actually might indicate that we're spending too much, believe it or not. So that's kind of a dangerous road sometimes to walk, but that's a very common question that you'll get. So usually, it's, are we good? Are we bad? How do we compare with others? The other one I probably get the most besides those is, especially if you have a report and let's say you have a list of 10 suggestions that they act on over the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years. They're going to ask, if you could pick anything off of this list, what would it be? Just one thing. And I get it, right? They're trying to understand where the priorities lie, right? What's going to give them the most risk reduction, and ideally for the least cost, right? That would be a win-win scenario for them in their eyes. So those are some of the things that will come up in a final findings meeting. A lot of them can be very straightforward. They'll usually ask you 1, 2, maybe 3 questions at the end, usually just like the ones we talked about. So nothing too crazy, nothing too exciting, nothing to be nervous about. Always speak openly and honestly and tell the truth. But that's the final findings meeting. So and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of the course as well, even though that last very part of the course is going to focus on mostly writing a successful OT pen test and give you a template with examples to help you write that report. So I'm actually excited about that section, even though it's probably probably everybody's least favorite, because nobody wants to write a report. But hey, if we're going to write it, and that's what the client's paying for, and that's our tool to help them improve and build a stronger, more defensible environment, you know what? Yeah, I really need to put a lot of effort into that. We do. So that is part 3. So again, if you've made it all the way, I appreciate you taking the time, especially part 3 of this course. Really excited that you're here, that you listened to this part. If you got a lot of great value out of it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and I will see you in the next part.